It's a very informal session, this, but you're not allowed to ask any questions whatsoever. But you will be able to do later on. I'm going to speak first to Ethel, speak to each of them in turn, and then we'll have a general discussion. But before I do speak to Ethel, we've got a short film to show you that she made recently.
My mother was a nurse in London, and my ambition always was to be a nurse. When the war started, I joined the Civil Nursing Reserve and I got moved to a military hospital. When I first went there, beginning of 1940, we had civilian patients from the Birmingham hospitals, because Birmingham by that time was getting air raids. And then one morning in 1940, the hospital was evacuated and we were all woken up early and told to be on duty on our wards. And then we saw this convoy coming up the hill. There were buses and lorries, one or two ambulances. When they stopped and they started to unload the vehicles, we realised that they were war casualties. We'd heard that about Dunkirk. The uniforms were absolutely stuck to their bodies. They'd been in water, they were covered with mud and sand and blood. The men had just been picked up from the different ports where they were landing and brought straight to the hospital. Some of them were absolutely exhausted because they'd been in the water for a long time and they'd got all sorts of wounds, cuts and bruises, burns, because when they left Dunkirk, the beaches were on fire in most places, so they really were in a bad way. It really was a shock to us because we'd only been treating civilian patients, you see, and we just had to do the best we could. Now and again, it really was tough. When I visited Dunkirk this year, it was the 70th anniversary of the evacuation. It was held on the Norfolk Line ferry, which had been commandeered for the day. We had 2 minutes silence. The bugler played the last post and everybody stood in silence. And I stood with an English veteran one side of me and a French veteran the other side, and we held hands. And while we were standing there in silence, there was a sudden shower of rain, and it was just as if nature was taking part in this ceremony, and the rain was mingling with the tears of all the people there. Sometimes I think it seems like a dream. It's, so long ago. We used to love our reunions. 20 years was the first reunion, and we had reunions every so often until all my friends who had been with at the time, they've all passed away. I'm always thankful that I did live through that time, because it's sort of coloured my life more or less, and all the things I've done since then. A lot of it connected with the time I spent during the war, and it's something about nursing, that's different.
Ethel, why were you so passionate about nursing? From a very young girl you were passionate, weren't you?
Well, I think it was because of my mother. She was always so passionate about nursing, and she was a nurse during the First World War, except that she wasn't in any military capacity at all. She worked in a mission in London all through the Blitz, and that's why I was so keen to be a nurse.
It's set up on the screen, Burntwood Military Hospital.
Yes.
It wasn't really a hospital, was it? It was just some huts.
Well, it was just built because of they started to build it before the war, when, you know, everyone thought there was going to be a war. And it was in the grounds of the psychiatric hospital. And they built 7 huts, which were the wards. There were already some brick buildings there, which were used for other things. But the Nissen huts, other Nissen huts were built as operating theatres, and the day nurses' home, and different things. But the offices were in the brick building part of the hospital. It was spread out a little bit, but it was in the country, and it was all fields around.
It must have been a massive learning curve for you, because you'd be doing what we might call domestic nursing, and
That's
suddenly
right.
these horrific injuries were appearing.
Yes, well, at the time I was working at the Manor Hospital in Walsall, and because I was a member of the Civil Nursing Reserve, it meant that if there was a war, I was to go into a military hospital. So this was near, the Burntwood one was nearer home, so that was where I went. But it was quite different to the ordinary nursing. I mean, we'd never seen anything like the shrapnel wounds and the terrible burns, and well, the way they were all shattered, their minds were shattered. And
Were you learning on the job then?
oh yes, we had a lecture once a week, but that was just if we had time to go to it, but wasn't very often. We'd perhaps go to a lecture, be there for 10 minutes, and then there'd be a call, you know, and another convoy was coming in, rush back to the wards, and that was happening all the time. So really, didn't learn much theory at all. It was just all hands-on nursing, and just learned as we went along.
You mentioned that the officers were in a sort of better place. Did you treat them differently, the officers and the men?
Oh, well, they were treated the same as the men. I mean, they all had the most wonderful care, because in those days, nurses only went into the job if they were absolutely caring and, you know, wanted to do the job. They didn't go in it for the money. We were paid 6 and 8 pence a week. But that did include laundry and food occasionally. Sometimes we were so hungry at night that we had to, there'd be 2 nurses on a ward with 40 beds, and one would creep out of the hut into a field at the back and dig up a potato, which we'd take back into the ward and cook in the oven. So that was what it was like then. But you know, the nursing was quite different to you know, ordinary nursing, you know, at civilian hospital.
Yeah, I mean, you tell a story about when somebody's got plaster on their arm or on their leg, how you used to deal with that when it itched.
Yes, well, most of the officers we had were fractures and shrapnel wounds, and when the plasters had been on for a week or 2, it used to get rather itchy, and we'd have to provide knitting needles for them to scratch down the plasters. And one day an officer was brought in and his arm was shattered, and I went with him to the theatre, and there was hardly anything left of his well, you couldn't tell where his fingers were or anything like that. So he was treated and plaster put on. 6 weeks later, when I took him back into the theatre and the plaster was taken off, the wound, the arm was healed, because although it got gangrene when he came in, the maggots had eaten the gangrene.
So you knew when to take the plaster off was when the maggots started crawling out.
Start to just creep out of the ends of the plasters.
Might be worth doing nowadays, you never know.
But I believe that maggots are used now, but for years, you know, I don't think anybody believed what had happened then.
You were a young woman, many of these also young men, and
Yeah.
women too. They must have died. They can't all have survived.
No, I was 18, and the first convoy we had in was the men were brought in just as they'd been picked up from Dunkirk, and they were all absolutely exhausted. None of them could speak. We had to cut their uniforms from their body, and then, you know, the doctors, we'd only got 2 doctors at the time, and they would come round and try to do what they could for them. But it took weeks before the men really settled down. They were so shattered by what had happened to them, being in the water all that time, and then perhaps getting towards a boat, and before they could get on it, it was blown up. But some had already been prisoners in France, been captured and escaped again. And some of the tales that I was told by the veterans who'd been there when I went to Dunkirk, and they were telling me about some of the terrible things that had happened, not only to the forces, but to the civilians there as well.
You mentioned earlier some Poles that came over who'd been in Dachau.
That's right. Towards the end of the war, when some of the prisoners were being released from the different camps in Germany and different places, we had 12 Polish airmen who'd been prisoners all through the war in Dachau. And none of them had got fingernails. They were all blind and many other injuries. And they all died within the week.
You talk in the film finally about, not finally because we'll hear more from you later, but you talked about the effect that experience has had on you in the rest of your life. How do you mean? How did it affect the rest of your life?
Well, when the war ended and I was married, after I should have been married on the 27th of May 1940, which was the day I was in Dunkirk for the celebratory service for the men from Dunkirk. That was the day I should have been married, but my fiancé was sent abroad a week before we should have been married. And it was 5 years before we got married. So during that time, I was at the military hospital all through the war. And then in 1946, when I left, all the patients had been discharged by then to different hospitals, and we weren't getting any more convoys. And so I worked as a health visitor and did a bit of private nursing, and there was nowhere else to work at the time. The hospitals weren't taking any more nurses because they were short of money and food and everything else at the end of the war. And so, and then there was we had a new clinic built in the village, and I worked in there as district nurse to start with. But all my life afterwards, I couldn't be anywhere that there wasn't something to do with nursing. When we first went to live in this village, my husband was chief ambulance officer, and the people around soon got to know that we knew a bit of medical things, you know. And they were all old people in this village, and we found that almost every day somebody was dying. And in those days, if anybody died, they had to pay for somebody to look after them when they, when they died. And it got so bad that at one time we were taking it in turns to get up in the night to go and lay them out. So I was, even then, it was all connected with my nursing experience. And then I went into, I changed my career. I went into dental nursing, became a tutor, and then president of the Dental Nurses Association.
And I should say, she's still working. I said, when did you retire? She said, which retirement? Because she's been retiring all her life. She retired from doing Tai Chi at 89 last year, but she still teaches it, so we'll talk. The next of our three nurses that we're going to speak to is Anne Watts. Now, I met Anne first a couple of months ago when I interviewed her about this book, which she's written, Always the Children, and I'd really strongly recommend it. It's a very moving, very wonderful book, and in fact, she's going to, after we've finished, she'll be signing copies if people want to buy and sign a copy and have a chat to her just outside where the coffee is. Pritchard's, by the way, a lovely bookshop in Crosby, are the ones who brought the books along for her to sign. But to give you a flavour of it before I speak to you, I'm just going to read a short extract from the very beginning of the book, Anne.
Thank you. My father's face turned a deep shade of purple. He slammed his fists down onto the polished breakfast table, sending nervous ripples across the surface of our milky porridge bowls. No daughter of mine is going to spend the rest of her life wiping other people's arses. I will not have it. That's my final word. I realised then, as I do now, that no father wants to see his daughter work long, hard, unsociable hours for poor wages. What I didn't realise then was that nurses had not only long been forced to tolerate working in an atmosphere of civility to doctors, but were even once upon a time thought of as little more than camp followers and prostitutes. What sort of woman, it was thought, would want to wash the bodies of strange men? It's our sort of women, isn't it? But we were no longer in the Middle Ages, and no tantrum or explosion from my father would shift my decision or shake my determination. This was my point of no return, the defining moment when the rite of passage, part golden idyll, part horror story that had been my childhood, was complete. My decision to take up nursing as a career sprang from a deep need to express love and compassion, inherited, I believe, from my generous, warm-hearted, socially aware mother, who was a nurse. I couldn't have known at the outset that nursing would also fulfill my thirst for travel, inherited from my salty sea captain father, and nurtured by a wonderful, imaginative geography school teacher. The journey, both professional and personal, that I have taken through life has been constantly challenging, often daunting, sometimes frightening, but the rewards have been infinite. My travels and my nursing in cultures, climates, and circumstances so different from my own have not only fulfilled my desires and ambitions, but have given me an enormously privileged insight into the human condition. I've learned that we have the power and the capacity to make this world a better place, that walls of suspicion and fear can be replaced by bridges of kindness, care, and understanding, and nurses play a huge part in that.
They surely do, and this book, that's just the very beginning, and the subtext, the subtitle of the book is a nurse's story of home and war. There's a sort of another story in it as well as the nursing. But the nursing is extraordinary because it's very hard to sort of praise this book. You've been all over the world nursing. You're laughing when I say it, but whenever there's a war on, you seem to sort of gravitate towards it. First of all, let me ask you why you wrote the book. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, for many years, like some 20 years, friends, family, people I met along the way encouraged me to write these extraordinary stories which are about the people that I nursed. And I set the bar high for myself. First of all, I thought, write a book. Well, you only do that when you're old. And then I looked in the mirror one day and I thought, now might be a good time. But I wanted it to be a tribute to the people I have nursed, the people I've worked alongside, the young soldiers whose hands I've held as they passed away, and the children whose lives are blown to smithereens. I wanted the reader to feel as though they were looking over my shoulder and seeing what I was seeing and feeling what I was feeling. And that's what I've done. And it seems to have hit a nerve with lots of people.
in the same way, you ended up, you worked for Save the Children, that's really what took you overseas.
Initially.
And that took you to Vietnam.
Yes.
Again, you must have had a steep learning curve in the way that Ethel had a steep learning curve in Dunkirk.
Well, I mean, Friday and Saturday nights at Manchester Royal Infirmary were pretty rough, but...
That's where you trained, yeah. They still are, I'm told. But
so I'd had a bit of, you know. But my God, when nothing prepares you for looking into the face of war, and particularly, I've always been a civilian. I've never been in this sort of uniform. And to see what happens, well, to everybody, but to civilians in particular, just makes you so angry. And it has left me not depressed, but passionately angry towards politicians, not just for the where are the politicians with vision? Because of their poor vision and lousy decision making and extraordinary expenditure on military adventures and illegal wars, at the same time cutting mental health budgets, when our servicemen and some women are coming home disturbed by what they've seen and done, and many end up on the streets and in prisons. This is a wonderful country. I've lived in many countries, and I always come back to Britain. Our country deserves better. The NHS deserves better, and nurses certainly deserve better.
it sounds as though Always the Children is a political book, and it is, with a small p. But the really great joy of it is, joy's not perhaps quite well, are the stories within it. And there are some, just pick out some of those stories from any of those areas, Vietnam, the Cambodian refugee camp, wherever.
Right, Sakiao, 42,000 people lying on the ground, 1979. These were the victims of Cambodian people who had been the victims of 4 years of the Pol Pot regime. I've never seen anything quite like that with my own eyes. Anyway, it moved on. First 10 days, over 2,000 people died and had to be buried in mass graves. You were really just separating the dead from the living. I'd learned to triage, but my God, this was the most amazing triaging exercise I'd ever been involved in. It moved on, and out of this mass of desperately ill people, many of whom had been tortured, so they were psychologically damaged. It's the only time in my life where I've gone like this to help someone who was on the ground, and they've done this. That's a very shocking thing to see, and it gave me just a small inkling of what the people who liberated the concentration camps must have been seeing on a much larger scale. It's only a chink of an inkling, but that's when I got a taste of what man can do to man, if you like. Anyway, in this morass of tragedy, a man-made tragedy, 2 of the refugees I've remained in touch with them on and off over the years. One was Selena, who was 22 at the time, and another was a 14-year-old tomboy girl called Vichita. Both were very ill, both had been tortured, both were in a hell of a state, really. And we took them on as our team members of the Save the Children Fund team, gave them extra food rations and so on. They grew stronger. And today, Vichita was taken to Canada in a section of refugees that were given shelter in Canada. She studied law. She's now a lawyer. She went back to Cambodia, saw the state the country was in, decided to set up her own charity which provides legal aid for women and children who have been rescued from the human traffickers throughout Southeast Asia. And she now is the Cambodian representative, well, the Southeast Asian representative at the UN on the human trafficking throughout Southeast Asia. I mean, how extraordinary that out of that, and it makes somebody's secret in Washington, waste of human beings there is in the carnage of war. And when we see on our television screens masses and masses of displaced people because of these lousy decision makers, you wonder who, there could be a Mozart, there could be a Wichita, there could be us. And it's just reinforced my belief that each and every one of us has a part to play in this world. Every single one of us makes a difference, can make a difference, and does make a difference.
There are some lovely stories in Always the Children about the difference that Anne and her colleagues, of course, have made. And there's not really time, but the one story I really loved was the story about the guitar and the American soldier.
Oh, hope I don't cry. I call it Hey Jude. And whenever I hear Hey Jude on the radio or wherever, I'm gone, I'm just gone. And my mind immediately floats over to the mountains of central mountains of Vietnam, where the hill tribes live. And I spent a year and a half at a bush hospital there, nursing the hill tribes people. And there was a young American soldier who used to come in some evenings with his guitar. Denny was his name. And he had a beautiful voice, and he loved the Beatles. He was from Philadelphia. I don't know why that's important for me to say, but Denny from Philadelphia. And he used to sit amongst the patients, and I'm not talking rows of orderly beds. These were straw mats with hundreds of people in varying stages of illness and injury. He'd just sit in the middle of them, and he'd sing, and he'd strum his guitar, and he'd just sing. And, it's just so touching, I can see it now. And you could have heard a pin drop other than his beautiful voice. And Hey Jude was his favourite. And he had a special little friend amongst the Montagnard helpers, and his name was Hiao. And he was a young tribesman who had lost one of his feet in a mine accident. And the doctor who ran the hospital took him on and trained him to be like a healthcare assistant. And he and Denny were good friends, and he was quite fascinated by the guitar, especially. Anyway, Denny was killed, and his commanding officer came to the hospital one day to tell us. And with him, he had Denny's guitar and the little old-fashioned tape recorder that Denny used to play his tapes on. And he said that Denny wanted Hiao to have these. Well, of course, he disappeared for days. We didn't see him for days. We knew that he was off grieving for his friend. But when he came back, the guitar was always with him, and he taught himself to sing and play chord perfect, word perfect, but that's all he could sing and play, Hey Jude. And whenever anybody went to Hong Kong or somewhere on leave, they'd say, do you want any shopping doing? We'd say, oh yes, batteries. And God knows what these American soldiers must have thought these nurses wanted batteries for, rather not think about it. But it was for this blasted tape recorder. And he played and played and played the Hey Jude, and by the time I know and that's what I think of whenever I hear it on the radio. Special. These are special stories. They are very special, and there are many more like that in the book, and I would really strongly make you afterwards, when there's a signing of them at the back, do go and get hold of a copy. It's fantastic. So now to the youngest of the three, who was hardly born when Ethel retired. Or did one of her retirements anyhow. Flight Lieutenant Kerry Poole. Just explain what it is you do, Kerry.
I'm employed by the Royal Air Force as the Princess Mary's Air Forcing nursing officer, and my current role, I'm based as a flight commander at RAF Lynham on a deployable aeromedical response team. My speciality is intensive care nursing, so in addition to that, I am part of the team for critical air support. And our ultimate aim is to repatriate those critically injured, entitled civilians and service personnel from anywhere around the world and bring them back for definitive care and treatment.
Now, people know RAF Liner because they know Wootton Bassett and they know that the bodies come through there. Yeah. But actually, you're saving a lot of people who Ethel, she'd never even seen them, presumably, because they would not have got as far as a hospital.
No, everybody, obviously, it's highly publicised on the news about Wootton Bassett and RAF Liner, for those fallen guys that don't make it home. But for everyone that's fallen, there's probably 3 or 4 others that have been injured as a consequence. And what we found over the last decade, I would say, is we've had people with injuries that have survived that wouldn't have survived then. And that's a whole team effort that goes back from the medic, his buddy on the ground, who saves him initially, all the way through to the medical emergency response team who do life and limb saviour in the back of a helicopter on the way back to hospital. The guys in the hospital that work, you know, from the ED department down to theatres, to intensive care, and then for us to bring them home. And then their care doesn't stop once we get them home. They go to Birmingham, as people are probably aware, and we work in collaboration with NHS colleagues who do a phenomenal job to keep these guys alive, get them rehabilitated, and give them some quality of life.
You started in the NHS. I mean, you're still the NHS, really, but you started not in the Air Force.
No, I joined the Air Force 8 years ago, and I trained in Portsmouth, and we had military. When I trained then, we had military on our course, and their job just seemed so exciting and so different. And my motivation for joining the forces was all my friends were getting married and settling down and having children, and I wanted a challenge. I wanted something different. I wanted to go to places, and I joined the RAF in 2003, 2 months after the Iraq War kicked off. So I joined to go to these places. I joined to look after our service personnel. I joined to be tested and put out of my comfort zone instead of going to work every day. Do something different. Be different.
Although you're based at Lynham, you haven't been at Lynham all your career, have you? You've been in Afghanistan. You've been at Bastion.
Yes.
Working in that. Have you ever been in the helicopter that brings them to Bastion?
No. I've done several roles. I've been at Bastion and I've been in Iraq as well. My first tour I worked in the intensive care there. I then went to Iraq and was the aeromedical liaison officer, so coordinating all of those that have been injured, organising for them to be transported back to the UK. My last tour I did critical care air support team, so CCAS, but tactically. So we would transfer patients in and around Afghanistan, but they are ventilated, sedated patients. I look after intensive care patients. And then my role in the UK, as well as working at RAF Lynham, I strategically go and pick the guys up so we can fly anywhere around the world to pick up critically injured service personnel or entitled civilians.
This won't necessarily be Afghanistan or Iraq?
Obviously, we're armed forces. We work in a purple umbrella, so we work Army and Navy. And if the Navy, say, have an injured sailor aboard ship, then we will go and retrieve them and bring them back.
Now, how quickly can you get out there, and what plane are you using?
It depends. Within the Air Force, we've got C-17s, and they're great big loadmasters. I think one of the lifts I did last year, we had 15 stretchers on board and 1 walking wounded on board that aircraft that day. We have Tri-Stars, which are a bit like your Boeing 737s, which have stretcher fits, and we have 2 with all-round access for our critical care patients. And then we have VC-10s, which are our old ladies of the service, really. They've been in service for a very long time. Generally don't use those as often as we use the C-17s and Tri-Stars. And
are they fully equipped?
No, as I say, the Tri-Stars always have stretcher fits in. With the C-17s, depending on the number of patients we have and the types of patients, we will set the aircraft up. I don't know whether people watched Air Hospital. That would give you an idea of how we work and how we set things up. For each patient we go to collect, critical care patient we take 500 kilos worth of kit.
You're very successful, aren't you? I don't mean you personally. I mean, in getting these soldiers back. I was talking about how Ethel's soldiers, many of them are done. You're very successful in actually rescuing people and saving people who would never be saved, maybe even 5 years ago.
I think it's a whole team effort. It's not just what the Air Force do. It's obviously the armed forces as a whole. As I go back to earlier, it's the person on the ground doing the initial life-saving treatment of their mate, of their buddy, that is enabling them to live, to get them to hospital, and then the treatment that they have there, they are taken into theatre straight away, their injuries are managed, and they're looked after and then brought back for the
What
whole
about
process.
your specialist skills? Have you got different skills than you had in the NHS?
No, I worked in intensive care before I joined the Air Force, and obviously my skills have continued throughout. So I'm an intensive care nurse, but just work in a different arena. Working in the back of an aircraft is probably no different than working in a nice hospital somewhere where you've got all your settings. The only thing that is different is we have to be self-reliant. The kit we take has to get us through till we get back. And you have to think on your feet a little bit more. You have to be adaptable and flexible, because if your patient deteriorates in flight and you're halfway, 4 hours on an 8-hour journey, you haven't got the luxury of calling in your colleagues. So you've got to think, adapt, possibly divert in order to get the best care for that patient.
Is there any particular occasion that you remember that you're particularly proud of, that something really went well?
There's so many occasions that you're proud of. The guys that we look after, the boys and girls, they're inspirational, and to single out one incident, it's so difficult because they're young, they are motivated, they're inspirational. So you sit there and you think, they've just had terrific injuries. They may have lost limbs, they may have lost both legs and an arm, but they are determined, they want to get up and go, they don't see obstacles, they just adapt and overcome, and they challenge themselves. So to identify individuals, scenarios, it's so difficult.
Listening to Ethel and listening to Anne, and you're actually all the same, really, aren't you? Nothing's changed. I mean, there's generations here. I mean, listening to her work, it really was your work. You same kind of feelings around it.
Yes, I think so. I think if you start as a nurse, it never goes away. It influences the whole of your life. And, you know, all the time, you've got that background. There's nothing more satisfying, I don't think, than being a nurse.
You certainly feel that as well, Anne, don't you?
Well, I was just sitting here thinking the arenas of war change, but the essence of nursing doesn't, nor should it.